Hi, you're listening to the Business Essentials Daily Summer Series, the best episodes of 2022. Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. Almost all workplaces have at least one. You know who they are. Those self-entitled people who think only of themselves and to hell with everyone else. So, what can you do about them? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. You can bet your bottom dollar that a self-entitled staff member will impact the rest of the team, causing upset and resentment if the person in question isn't brought to account. So, how can you reel them in? Well, according to workplace expert Michelle Gibbings, be prepared for not just one or two conversations, but an ongoing regular dialogue about expectations, theirs and yours. Chris Ashmore asks Michelle whether there's an increase in self-entitled employees, or are bosses just getting older and perhaps less tolerant?
Well, I think it probably might depend on what demographic you're posing that question to. Certainly there are some people who say, the younger generation is getting more entitled. Then there might be some people in the younger generation who are saying, well, actually, I think some of those older people are pretty entitled. So I think it depends on from what angle you're looking at it.
Why do some staff have this sense of entitlement?
From a psychological perspective, it is actually a condition. It's connected with narcissism. And, like all sorts of, in some respects, almost like personality traits, there's varying degrees of entitlement. And it can come from various different sources. It might have come from your upbringing. It might be that you've been treated in a certain way. You just expect to be continuing to being treated in that way. So there's, a whole raft of different variables. But the key thing for leaders to really watch and be aware of is, can you spot it in your employees? Because what's the impact it's then having on the rest of your team?
So how do you spot that in your employees? What are the behavioural signs?
There's a couple of things. So if you've got an employee and they're always expecting that they get preferential treatment, they get the best gigs, they get the biggest pay rise, they can take holidays whenever they want to. It's all about them, and they just expect that things are going to work out the way they want them to work out with no consideration of the impact of their behaviour on other people. And the research shows this, that one of the key things with people who, have psychological entitlement is they often have lower engagement levels. They're more likely to rationalise their behaviour because they see it as, this is acceptable behaviour because I'm doing this to get what I want and what I need. And they're also more prone to conflict, both with colleagues and with their boss.
So what can bosses do about it then? How can they handle entitled employees?
The key thing is a conversation. So the first part of this is, you never walk into these conversations unprepared, and it's a two-way conversation because you need to understand where your employee is coming from. Because firstly, their expectations and your expectations, what's the gap? That's what you want to find out. And if they have an expectation, be open to yourself and open to the conversation. Is their expectation reasonable? Because you might be sitting back and thinking that they're entitled, and they might be going, but when we were talking about this work, this is what I was expecting, and we've had this conversation. So make sure that you're understanding where they're coming from. And then also you want them to understand where you're coming from. So through that conversation, you get really clear around what are those expectation gaps? And if they do, for example, want a pay rise, what is it that they would need to show or demonstrate to really be able to get that pay rise? And it's about helping them understand the impact that their behaviour is having on other people in the team.
There's always a next step for your business. There's always help at every stage. As you grow your business, we're here to support you every step of the way. Move forward with Mazars. Visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.
So this is something that the leader has to be conscious of and tap the employee on the shoulder and say, hey, I'd like to have a chat with you. How do you initiate a chat, though? That can be quite difficult.
It can. And look, I often see this with leaders. Leaders don't like tough conversations. They'll often step back. And the mark of a good leader is a leader who is willing to step in and have that conversation. And you don't need to go in all guns blazing or anything like that. You want to go in with a conversation because get clear on your intent. What is it that you want to achieve through this conversation? And hopefully what you're wanting to achieve is you want the employee to have some, better understanding and self-awareness of the impact that their behaviour and their requests are having on others. So it's not a one-hit wonder. You're not going to just have that one conversation and then tick, it's done. You have the conversation, you set up that sense of this is what I'm expecting and what I'm looking for. How do you feel about that? You get feedback from them and then you monitor. Are you seeing that their behaviour is actually changing based on the conversation that you've had? Because if it's not changing, then you have potentially an even tougher decision to make, because do you really want them in the team? Are they, having an impact to the extent that it's dragging the rest of the team down? And, if you think about employees and actually humans just in general, we are acutely attuned to fairness. And if you are in a team and you can see one team member who gets preferential treatment, they're the squeaky wheel and they get everything, and you're the person who's quieter but hardworking and you feel like you're not getting your fair share, you end up disgruntled and you'll either end up leaving the organisation or your engagement levels and therefore performance starts to drop as well.
You mentioned that it's an ongoing conversation. It's not a set and forget. You've got to keep an eye on addressing the issue. How does a boss do that? Is it something that they've got to schedule something in all the time or just as things go along? Well,
hopefully as a leader, you've got that regular pattern of conversations with your team and also with each of your direct reports individually. And so, you might have weekly check-ins or it might be fortnightly, and this just becomes part of that conversation. And so, you might be checking in on work, but then what you're also doing at the same time is going, the conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago, have you had a chance to think about it? How are you feeling? What have you done? Where are you seeing that perhaps there's more work to do? So you keep that conversation alive, because what can often happen is when you initially have that conversation with the employee, they might be going, but I don't do that. I've never seen myself do it. And what you want to be able to do is give them fresh examples. You're much more likely to get a reaction that's a good reaction if you can work with data that's fresh and data that the employee can connect with. Whereas if you're using data points that are 6 months old, the employee goes, I just don't even remember that happening. So it's important to keep that conversation alive and to also just make it part of that every day. So it's, seen as something that you're continuing to focus on. And it's like a coaching conversation, because what you're doing is you're coaching them and helping them to see the impact of their behaviour and their expectations on others.
Any final thoughts, Michelle, on how a boss, what they should think about when dealing with an entitled employee?
I think one of the big things is, as a leader, firstly, check that you're not entitled too, because, if you're going to sit down and have a conversation with your team member about, I think your expectations are a bit out of kilter, and yet you're the person who always takes that biggest piece of everything that's on offer, the employee is going to sit back and go, really? You're saying that to me? Look what you do. So the leader needs to lead by example.
That was workplace expert Michelle Gibbings. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.